Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I have with me Aakash Gupta, who is the product growth guy. That right, Akash?
Yes, sir. I've been working
And
in
get
product growth now for
and
15
we
years.
we recently wrote a post, co-wrote a post. We collaborated together on the rise of Indian gaming, and that will be the focus of today's discussion. But before jumping into that, I thought we could go a little bit over your background as well, Akash. If you can tell us a little bit more about your history and career.
Sure. Yeah. Like many product people started out in engineering and then made the shift over first to a small company in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then transplanted over to the Bay Area. Spent a decade in the Bay Area in product at places like ThreadUp and Google. And most recently, entered the gaming world by working on Fortnite at Epic Games. And that's when I got exposed to you and your content. I think we traded some tweets at some
Yeah.
point. And as one of my hobbies, just my entire life has been writing, and I've had different outlets, but recently been writing more online. And so the rise of the Indian gaming market was just a topic that begged to be written about, I think, and really excited to have written it with you.
Yeah, and I know that you are Indian American, but was there anything in particular about the Indian gaming industry? And I can go into why I'm interested in it as well. But was there anything specifically that kind of interested you about covering that topic in particular?
Yeah, the just tremendous amount of news that's been coming out of the market, whether it's,
Yeah,
sponsor Virat Kohli, easily like the most recognizable person to a lot of people who don't follow India even that closely, but are just part of the diaspora, signing on to a gaming company, or so many unicorns being minted. It seems like a hotbed for innovation. And if you think about the news, and then you
yeah,
think about what it was like as a practitioner in the gaming industry, right? Like,
yeah.
does Epic Games prioritize India? Not yet, of course, because of the average revenue per user. And so
Right.
that reality of what it's like to be in the gaming industry and then seeing like, okay, maybe Free Fire is making like $10 million a month. Does that cover their costs to service those users because they have a pretty high cost? And thinking through some of those elements just beg to be written about. And I didn't see anybody having actually covered it from that historical angle. And so
Right.
that was kind of where I thought we could add some unique value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from my perspective, our company is basically headquartered essentially in Bangalore. The almost all of our employees are from Bangalore. I'll be spending most of my time there as well. And so I really did want to have better context and to think more critically about it. And I know, as a product manager, or you as a product manager, and me having a history in product management as well, one of the things that I do think is not done enough, kind of popularized by Jeff Bezos and Amazon, is to really like write down your thoughts to really clarify your thinking and understanding of a topic. And so I'm glad we were able to kind of do that. So, but yeah, I mean, I thought we could then kind of just talk about, maybe we can kick it off with like the history of the Indian gaming industry. Why has it been a little bit slower to develop than other places, and kind of a little bit of the context of that. And that this was a section that you wrote about. So it'd be great for you to kind of talk a little bit about where the history and where you think the Indian gaming market is today.
Yeah, the most notable thing you'll realize when you dive into the Indian gaming market is that it seems like it's in the past. Like you go to India today and parlors and arcades are almost like to the level where they were in the 80s in the United States. And that has to do with two big drivers. One is the money and access to the game. If you think about it, like the cost to entry to gaming had historically been fairly high. To be able to buy like a Nintendo system for $300 plus the 100% import tax, so 600 US dollars for an
Yeah.
Indian was very much out of reach. If you think about the GDP per capita in India being about $2,000, you're not going to spend a third of your income on a gaming console. So the
Right.
arcade cost to entry has been
Yeah.
low. And because of India's still per capita GDP being so low relative to a console, that had been a big entry point. So in America, we actually saw this huge decline in gaming and gaming parlors in the 80s and 90s and
Right.
2000s and 2010s as we saw this rise in home gaming. And in India, that happened later. So in the 80s, we saw the gaming parlor. And what was really cool is that we're all used to like these classic machines, like these boxes that come from companies. But in India, it was actually those $600 Nintendo systems. They would build a box around that system. So I thought that was really cool how that's what they started from. And we estimate when we looked at the numbers that there were only roughly like a million video gamers at a time. So there were roughly about 2,000 of these video game parlors, and the types of people who are coming to these mainly lived in urban centers. So it really wasn't until the late 80s and 90s when India was electrified, and specifically the rural areas were electrified, that people started to get PCs. And that's when gaming really started to go into the double digit millions, 10 million plus type user. And so that was pretty interesting. That happened in the 90s. And it just continued this idea of where they were in the past. So
Right.
we were all buying PlayStation 3s. I believe PlayStation 3 was something like 2004. And they were actually really excited about PlayStation 2s when we look at the early 2000s in India. And the reason was this history of piracy kind of helping grow the Indian gaming market.
Right.
So PS2 discs, as all of us old school gamers know, are pretty easy to copy. Like I personally had like a hard drive in my PlayStation 2 where you just could download like hundreds of games. And the PS3 changed everything because people wanted to game online and people wanted game updates and it was harder to copy. So the PS3 never actually took off. But in India, Sony released some numbers like they sold a million PS2s that year that the PS3 was released worldwide. So it's pretty interesting. And in fact, even today, like if you go to like a hardcore PlayStation console gamer in India, it's more likely that they're on a PS4 than they are a PS5 still. So it's pretty interesting how the market has played out in consoles. And then the final wave that came about that has helped bring India kind of like more in line now with the rest of the world has been mobile and
Right.
COVID. So mobile, what we've seen is that the cost for data in India is significantly lower than the rest of the world. And this is enabling that lower income population to come online almost at similar rates to the rest of the world. And as they come online, they're finding that they have free to play games now. And so that has really been a humongous catalyst. So we released some numbers in our article, but we're estimating like roughly a half a billion gamers in India today. So this just become a gigantic market. And now it's finally kind of caught up. So that's kind of our take.
Yeah, and I can definitely agree in terms of like the sheer volume from an installs perspective, like some of the top games, especially shooters, and for whatever reason, I think that India is definitely a market where shooters are very popular, but the percentage of installs from India relative to other geographies is tremendous. And I also think that the if you look at whether it's Sensor Tower or Data.ai, that the actual revenue being generated, my understanding, it's not being reported accurately, where it's actually potentially significantly higher than is being reported. So um, I definitely think that it's a quickly growing market. I also think that, one of the other things to note is that on the mobile side, I think it was like Geo had released, I think 2 years ago, an unlimited data plan for a ridiculously low price, which just really like exploded the market. And I think this is a good example of when uh, government or private industry invests in infrastructure, and by enabling that infrastructure, it will enable new markets to really flourish. But I definitely felt like that had a pretty significant impact in terms of the mobile gaming uptake in India as well.
Yeah. What do you think the role of the government's banning of PUBG and Free Fire has had on that shooter market in India?
Well, I mean, it's really kind of shifted, right? So, like, we saw PUBG, and if you believe, like, let's say some of the data providers' numbers, which I think are actually too low, that PUBG was getting up to like 8 to 10 million in IAP revenue per month. But Then what happened is that after they got banned, then Garena Free Fire started to basically just ramp to that level. And so it just essentially was just a shift over. And now that Garena Free Fire is now banned as of January, February, I assume that those numbers flow back to now Battlegrounds Mobile India BGMI, which is the game from Krafton rather than the one that was developed from Tencent in China. So it does seem like the audience is just shifting to the available product in the country.
Yeah, it seems like that core shooter market exists, kind of like we've seen in the rest of the world. And those players might shift what game, there might be a battle between Fortnite and Warzone for those
Yeah, yeah.
players or different games that come up. But it seems like a huge base and maybe one of the biggest genres. Like what's your genre, what's the genre take in India? We obviously see a huge success of gaming platforms and then like traditional Indian games like Ludo and Teen Patti. How do you think about like the dominant genres?
I think you're right. They do seem to be like hyper casual games, and specific to the Indian market are things like Ludo and I think it's called Carom or something like that. But we see those typically hit the top of the charts, at least on the mobile free to play side. But I do think that as the market grows and expands, and as the per player revenue increases, that we should see the uptake of other games in India. As when the economics make sense, I do think other types of game genres that are typically heavier on the spend side will probably start to target India more. I mean, India has players just like anywhere else that loves RPGs, that loves mech games, that loves like these deeper games. But I do think with the growth rate, and that's the thing that I think that people should not sleep on is, it's like kind of like the early days of the internet. You look at the crazy growth numbers and you're like, oh yeah, I guess internet will be something in a while. And then it just really, catches up to you really fast. And so that's kind of what we're seeing with India is that the growth numbers, especially since the data infrastructure on mobile has been made so accessible, it's skyrocketing. And I do think that even I was sleeping on the Indian market, even working in India and being there. It's just like, oh wait, these are the actual revenue numbers that are possible. It's definitely moving very, very fast. And I will also say, just like, anecdotally for me, a number of folks have been reaching out to me personally, just asking about India. Some pretty big gaming publishers and developers. It seems like they're starting to wake up to, wait a minute, maybe we should think about not only the Indian market, but the Indian, game development ecosystem as well. And I think that's something to highlight when we think about the opportunity in India is those two components, right? The one is the Indian market for product distribution, but also as a development ecosystem and as a place where we can potentially like build great new products coming from India.
Yeah, it has such a high fraction of the world's software engineers
Yeah.
that would only make sense that the developer ecosystem would grow. I saw that the numbers from BCG Sequoia were pretty interesting. So what they did is they broke down like by genre, like slightly different than some of us in the industry talk about it, but like board, sports, card, casino, casual, strategy, action, adventure, and two of the interesting trends that play out to me and I think are really relevant are that action adventure is about 15% of the market. So if we
Right.
think about like that huge numbers that everybody knows about for PUBG and Free Fire, those numbers are just one portion of the overall Indian gaming market. And actually, like you mentioned, like strategy is huge in India, where people play like Lords Mobile, Mobile Legends, Clash of Clans, Rise of Empire, Last Shelter Survival. Casual, of course, like anywhere, is a bucket. But then that card and casino bucket with the Teen Patti and these unique games, and then the board game bucket with Ludo King and Carom Pool are two really unique segments, I think, in India. So as a game developer, there's a little bit higher prominence of board, sport, card, and casino in the country. And part of that is also due to the success of some of these mobile betting platforms.
Right.
So in India, games like Golf Clash, the US, that's where most people are know about it, is like you put up $1 and you might win two, or you might win $1.80, right? So these small bet type games succeed a lot in India. And so that causes the success of these board and sport and card and casino games where people will put up 1 rupee, which is equivalent to like 3 or 4 cents. So very little amounts of money, and they're able to create a little bit of excitement. Or people are playing the fantasy cricket because everybody's crazy about cricket over there. So gaming in India is just a really diverse set of players now that it's almost 500 million people.
Right. And I think the other thing to take note of, and just to add a little bit of nuance to like the distribution of genres and types of games to the Indian market, is to not only to think about the distribution from a genre perspective with respect to audience, in other words, the number of players, where there may be a greater distribution towards these casual games, as well as revenue, which today is generally tracked just by IAP. But then also when you would, and I'm sure some of the data providers will soon unlock advertising revenue as well. But then, when you look at the opportunities in terms of like distribution, in terms of audience, distribution in terms of IAP revenue, and distribution in terms of overall revenue, and as advertising in India grows and as different, I think you want to watch how India grows, and then that the three different splits that you can look at in terms of the distribution of genre is a better way of understanding the specific nuance of what's happening in the Indian gaming market.
Yeah, would you say that the revenue is a little bit more? I would guess it's a little bit more concentrated in action, adventure, and strategy because if we look at the
Yeah,
time played, that's like another vector to understand.
yeah,
That is really concentrated in these shooters.
right. And Akash, I know you had looked at some of the key players as well, but maybe for our audience, maybe you could talk about who some of these big players are and some of the bigger games. I think you did have a section somewhere where you talked about some of them, right?
Yeah, yeah. So to summarize everything we just said about genres in the market, like this is a
Mhm.
market that's growing at 37%, right? This is already a
Yeah,
$1.8 billion market. This is going to be a $5 billion market in just by 2025. So it's like growing
right.
at a tremendous rate. Like if we think about it, it's growing in all of those segments we went through. It's growing faster than TV, books, newspaper, social and media, OTT videos, cinema and home entertainment, literally any market in audio. So it's the fastest growing entertainment market, which means that there's an insane number of players. So the way to think about the players in the Indian gaming market, there are like independent developers, there's gaming platforms, there's like studios and publishers. So these are like maybe like three of the most important to talk through. So
Okay.
within the independent developers, you see like uh, Lucid Labs, Frostwood Interactive, Underdog Studios, Sigma Games. They've been producing different things. Ludo King is an example that came out of that. Within the gaming platforms, you have like MPL, Winzo, Paytm First Games. And then within the studios and publishers, you have all sorts of people. We mentioned like Krafton as a big one, Moonfrog, Gamation is an interesting one that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, Dream 11, Nazara. So let's double click on three of those. Gamation, Nazara, and Dream 11. Gamation is actually, they created Ludo King. Ludo King is a game that is really popular in India. So that's an example where they didn't necessarily, what we'll talk about next is like create insane depth. Instead, they took like a cultural thing and kind of like followed. And there's been a lot of
Right.
fast followers of them who have then copied them. Nazara is that same example where they produce a lot of high breadth games and they distributed them through telecom publishers. And actually, since then, they've just had so much success that they've started to add a lot of depth into their games. They've been acquiring a lot of companies in esports and gamified learning. And Dream 11 is that fantasy cricket that I earlier alluded to. So you can kind of see from that India has a lot of bias, at least in the homegrown space, to these like slightly more casual board game or sports games.
Right. Yeah, I think it's 3 years ago, I would say, or 2 to 3 years ago, when I looked at the top grossing charts for mobile. I'd have to scroll way down to be able to get like literally to the 300, 400s, 500s to get to see a game from a Indian development studio. I think GameShun's Ludo King has since kind of come up to be in like the top 150, 200 or something like that. But I do think that that's kind of, speaking to how the market is growing. And you mentioned a lot of the growth. Certainly, when we look at just at the pulling all the way back to the on a macro level, the like kind of GDP per capita, it's India is the fastest growing economy in the world. And then to these specific players, I definitely think that you named a lot of the key companies out there, and maybe the other thing we could talk about is like the investment environment and things like that, because certainly what we're also seeing is we're seeing a lot of new companies starting to get funded and starting to develop in India as well.
Yeah. How do you think about, I love the classification we had in here, like the four types of investors. Like you've been on the ground, you uh, have investors like Bitcraft and different people. So you've actually been
Mhm.
out there raising it. And how has that been playing out? And how did you come up with these classifications of these four types?
Right. Yeah. So in terms of like the investors, basically classify them into the four types as you mentioned. So first are global gaming funds, meaning funds that invest on a global basis. Good examples of these are like Bitcraft, Galaxy Interactive, Hero Capital, Makers Fund, companies like that. And I think that one of the things that's been happening is that it's there's no longer a specific geographical focus in terms of investment. I think what we're seeing is with companies like Dream in Turkey and a lot of these other companies all around the world sprouting up and becoming very successful. These kind of global gaming funds realize that they need to be able to invest anywhere to be able to tap into the gaming market. The second thing that we have seen is that the generalist venture capital funds, and in particular when we look at India, so let's say you're Sequoia, Lightspeed, Benchmark, or whoever. I think what's happened since the pandemic has been that during the pandemic, a lot of these VC funds saw their portfolios basically on fire, and like a lot of the companies were in trouble. But the one investment that was actually not only doing well but really exploding was gaming. And so I think a lot of the generalist venture capital funds are now starting to redeploy, redistribute their capital towards gaming because they understand, with the next COVID pandemic or with whatever happens in the future, through a recession, through a pandemic, gaming survives, it even thrives through that kind of environment. So what we've been seeing in terms of the second type is like this reallocation, redistribution of capital. The third type would be India-specific funds, and I think Lumikai and Salone Segal over there, and Justin Keeling, and I think that they were kind of Lumikai was, I believe, the first fund to really focus on gaming in India. I think they did come in a little early, but betting on the market longer term, which I think was great. And I think we will see more of this as what we find is that the growth that we talked about really starts to accelerate, and the companies that whether it's investing in the Indian gaming development ecosystem or just for the Indian market as well, I believe there are going to be a number of companies that become very successful, and I do expect to see more of these India specific gaming funds with the specific focus and specialization on India start to sprout up as well. And the last one are the global strategics, and meaning some of these big global game companies that take a strategic interest in India. And I think Krafton was the first of these companies to really kind of bet heavily into India. And what we saw with them is, they committed to investing at least 100 million, and at the rate that they're going, I think they'll probably deploy even more. But the understanding to strategically be able to invest in India early to kind of lock up the market, and I can kind of understand that from their perspective. When you look at like what Tencent is doing, they're going around investing all over the world. And I think what and I don't know because I haven't talked to them about this, and although Krafton is one of our investors, so maybe I'll ask them later. But like, you know My guess, because this is what I would actually do as well, is if I saw Tencent going around the world, throwing massive dollars at a bunch of these game companies globally, and I understand that India is the fastest growing economy. You've got an early market in India that's developing, but with incredible growth rates. Then I would probably do exactly what Krafton has done, which is to basically get into India early, lock up a lot of the game companies, build relationships, kind of invest into those companies before the Tencent and the NetEases and the ByteDances and like all these other companies wake up and they're like, oh, damn, India is growing really fast. Let's try and get over there. So that's kind of my suspicion on global strategics. Krafton clearly the first in the market, but don't be surprised if we get more jumping in soon.
Yeah. I think that the excitement generated and publicity from Lumakai and Krafton portend pretty well for those final two categories.
Right.
Have we seen any, are there any big players outside of that? Has Tencent invested?
I think Tencent has invested in more of the platform companies and some of these like whether it's whether it's more Web3 or whether it's more in the real money gaming side, but more on the platform side. I think Krafton's the first to really invest more heavily on the content side. But yeah,
Very
I fully
interesting.
expect more of this to occur.
Yeah, it seems like so far the Sequoias and the Tencents, they seem to be like de-risking from kind of like the hits driven nature by focusing on these platforms. And those
Right.
platforms have just been doing tremendously. So we didn't touch on them that much earlier on, just for the audience. Like some of the names of these platforms are like MPL.
Yeah.
So MPL is the team that actually sponsors India's cricket team's uniforms and kits. They have been doing extremely well. So it seems like those types of companies have been doing well. What do you think? Why do you think the Indian market has seen more success with those types of gaming platforms?
Well, I actually think it has to do with, and we can talk about this in a bit as well, is the maturity of the Indian gaming development ecosystem. So we mentioned breadth versus depth. Currently, the Indian market is largely characterized the general basis in terms of being more casual, more lighter, and not really having the experience yet in terms of building really deep, highly monetizing, like new game development hasn't been the strength yet for India. Whereas it's been more about like, because a lot of the market was developed by like, let's say Zynga, EA, Sumo, companies like that, where it's been more about content cadence, live ops, and things of that nature. And so right now, platform, you don't need a lot of game understanding and you can take a lot of different games. And so I think that platform certainly makes sense to invest in terms of India right now as the Indian game development ecosystem begins to mature and gains more depth, gains more expertise and understanding in that ecosystem of companies that become closer to world class and then world class develop. It to me makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like as the developer ecosystem matures, we should expect more depth to come out of it,
That's right.
not just from you guys, but from everybody getting funded by all these venture capitalists. And maybe that transition us then into some of the trends that are driving the future for India. So we are forecasting that over 700 million gamers will exist in India by the end of 2025. And this is because mobile is just beginning to grow in India. So if we think about it, the internet connected population in the United States is 89% versus India is still only at 46%. So we still have this huge growth to happen. Then we have the adoption of gaming of those people. If we think about the US, it's at 52%, India 22%. So these two drivers mean that we're going to hit like in huge player numbers. Do you expect the platform shift, the types of games to change as we added these new players, or do you think that'll be roughly the same mix?
You mean in terms of genre? Do I think the genre
Yeah.
mix will? I do think. Okay, so like one thing that we do know about the App Store ecosystem is that it's an auction based market. So meaning that as monetization uh, changes, then you can also see the distribution in terms of what gets surfaced to players shift. So I do think like that it does have some dependencies on, let's say, like ads, like mobile ads start to monetize much more heavily than before. Then we should expect to see, you know, like more hyper casual or other types of games be able to monetize better, and we should probably see a shift in terms of those genres. And if like to the extent that per capita GDP increases and we're seeing more spend on different genres that have higher spend, like RPGs and games like that, then I do think that related to the increase in spend in the games, we should see the money that's generated by these games begin to then be able to capture additional audience in India as they advertise against those games.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like the same evolution that we saw here in the US, right? Where
Mhm.
at first you might be able to get some organic downloads, but ultimately, like to hit that next level of growth, to capture those new users, it's all about being able to pay for those slots. And so the games with the highest LTVs, the games where people are spending a lot, like those RPGs and action adventures, might actually take a higher share from a genre perspective. And if we think about the numbers, right, the raw numbers, so the numbers that BCG reported were PPP adjusted. So that's like purchasing power parity. So basically, what that ends up doing is it like triples the Indian amount because India is a really cheap country. So if you think about it, purchasing power parity adjusted, Indians spend $3 to $10. Just raw numbers, they spend like $1 to $3 on average per year. But if we look at like a US or China, it's like 50 to 70 or even $80 per year. So I think that that fast per capita growth rate is going to
Yeah.
allow that disposable income and that monetization. And soon, once more games are monetizing and they're capturing higher LTVs, it'll follow the same path of the US market, which is whoever has the highest LTV is going to be able to drive those downloads.
Yeah, and to some degree, I would say just kind of a little bit of a detour, but supporting this thesis is the fact that one of the things that did happen during COVID is that so many companies then started to think about remote work and distributed teams, and then that led to just like a huge amount of focus on Indian developers, and so now you're starting to see wages increase dramatically. So that has effect as we become a more global world, and in which, you know, we start to increasingly see remote distributed work. I do think that that will only further accelerate the increase in per capita GDP for India.
Yeah, it seems like we're seeing that equalization of the pay scale where there was like these insane tech salaries concentrated in the Bay Area, London,
Yeah,
some of these expensive cities. Those are diffusing out. I would live
that's
in
right.
Durham, North Carolina. The salaries are doing the same here, and that's obviously going to happen in any place where that tech talent exists, like India. One of the other interesting trends that I find in India is that here in America, it's really, you seem smart if you poo poo like cloud gaming, right? It's like, oh, as gamers, like we know that our gamers care about frame rate and latency in their games. So they're certainly not going to be able to crank a 90 on Google Stadia. But in India, the attitude is completely different, both in terms of the gaming press and the players. Do you feel like cloud gaming India might be the market where it could actually have a future?
I mean, I actually think for me, cloud gaming isn't a matter of of if, it's like when, to me, and so I do think that um, you know, it's not only in India but everywhere. I do think cloud gaming is the future. Um, in terms of like the infrastructure in India, I do think that definitely on mobile with, you know, unlimited data and things like that, that only helps. So you know, not having looked a lot into cloud gaming in India, but my suspicion is that, you know, places like whether it's Korea or India I think there's really a really great chance for that to occur. And it's like one of these things. Like Dropbox existed many years ago as X Drive, almost the same identical product to Dropbox, but the timing wasn't right. So I do suspect that cloud gaming at some point makes it.
Yeah, I think that the attitude shift is going to be the biggest thing. So once people get a taste of gaming and realize that, it's not really like corrupting the youth, right? Like as they see their kids are playing these games, we've seen this tremendous shift. Like even in my own cousins, if I just reflect, like, okay, so I was playing like the Game Boy and I had that as an American, but they didn't have that because, oh, it might distract from their studies. But nowadays, like they have the same Roblox I do. They have the same shooters that I do. All the things are the exact same. And so that attitude shift has driven that acceptance. But with the lower cost to entry, for cloud gaming, I think that that's really going to drive continued growth. So shifting a little bit from the consumer now, we've been I think maybe we shift over now to the developer ecosystem, which is just the hottest thing I think in India. As you mentioned, like we're already seeing wage growth, we're seeing venture capital growth as we talked about, and we're also just seeing the raw company growth. We actually see like BCG measured the number of gaming studios, and it's just growing tremendously. There are over 200, and that number was like 20 just like 10 years ago. So if we think about that 10xing in the number of unique gaming companies there in India, it's certainly driven by the success of some of those Western developers, right? We see the Zynga studio seeding
Yeah.
so many future companies. Um, how do you expect that to affect your company and like the overall quality of talent in India and game development?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about the Indian game development ecosystem overall is just that it's early and it has certain type of orientation. And so I think that has several different impacts, which we wrote about in our report. But I mean, one of the key characteristics is just around the current orientation towards breadth versus depth. And I believe likely the reason why this has occurred is because what during the earlier market in mobile, if you just put something out, it kind of got a lot of installs, attention, and that was the way to make a business. You had a lot of folks who maybe didn't have a lot of experience in terms of game development who kind of entered, and so they made what they understood, and investing a lot into a single product versus if you're not that familiar with the gaming industry, you don't know exactly, or you don't have a strong conviction against a specific uh, product, then and what we have seen in practice in India is these studios that are working on 5 games, 10 games, sometimes even 15 or more games, and the teams are not that big, right? So basically, I think the prevailing legacy of the Indian game developer strategy has been, okay, we're not quite sure what's going to hit. Let's make a bunch of different games and see what hits, and then we'll invest into whatever hits. And so what's happened is like this philosophy and this orientation around small development cycles, putting something out there and seeing what happens. But in the current market, now that the mobile gaming ecosystem has matured, now that there is incredible depth and mastery and like a lot of nuance that's required to have a successful game, we're kind of shifting now to a market and basically a marketplace where instead of breadth, the pendulum has swung over to depth, where you really have to be deep and really understand your game at a very, very deep level because the competition now is global. You're competing against everyone in the world. And I do think that's one of the things that the Indian gaming development ecosystem is going to have to adapt to. Okay, let's not just like make oh, hey, Battle Royale seems to be doing well. Let's just make a shittier Battle Royale and see what happens. It's going to have to shift towards more depth and then more specific innovation. I think the second thing that has happened is that the because of the history and legacy of the Indian gaming development market, which has been that it was initially a large part of the mobile game development ecosystem was built up by companies like Zynga, Glue, EA that kind of started like more of a focus on live ops and more on content cadence. And then there were oftentimes, these companies would have like a Western counterpart that kind of told them what to do. And so right now, and it's not every company, but a lot of companies have had this legacy and history of being focused more on live ops, which I would argue, and others in the industry would argue, requires a very different mindset from new game development, kind of like the 0 to 1 versus 1 to n. And so that's something where I think there needs to be a little bit more training and a little bit more of a shift in focus from shifting from content cadence and live ops to, how do you make a successful new game? I think the third part is really around learning fundamentals, like understanding things that are very fundamental, first principles kind of level. And so right now, because of again that history in terms of how a lot of the Western companies would just say, "Hey, do this, do it fast, do it cheap," to now then understanding a lot of the situational context with respect to if I'm making my own game, why would I do it this way instead of that way? Why for so many different fundamental practices, whether it's your development, your scrum practice, how you design a sprint, how you do things in different ways. There's been a fundamental lack of understanding of like the whys. Why is it this way versus that way, and that sort of thing. And I think that once there does seem to be, well, I don't know if I can say that the shift is already occurring, but I do think that's a shift that needs to occur where more people in the Indian gaming development industry just really start to really understand the real fundamentals behind design, development, all these different best practices. And yeah, and I think that the maybe the two other things. One would be something that I'm calling mastery over management, which is and I don't know if this is I can only speak anecdotally, but I've now conducted hundreds of interviews with different game industry people in India. And I think the common theme, and again, this isn't everybody, but I do notice this pretty common trend where a lot of the folks who actually have 10 plus years of experience in a role are oftentimes worse than the people with 5 years or less of experience. And kind of like what I've seen is that it seems like the career trajectory for a lot of these folks in India has been okay, I'm going to be a whatever producer, PM, developer, or whatever for let's say five so years, and then I want to become a manager, and then I want to manage two people, then three people, and then bigger and bigger teams, and then they focus on, hey, what did you do? What did you do? What did you do? And then they stop learning their own skills. They don't continue to, like, if you're an engineer, continue to code, continue to develop mastery because I think the emphasis has been like, how do I view my self-worth in terms of like prestige, title, the number of direct reports that I have, because I want to be a manager and that the value or the perception of self-worth and value seems to be more focused on being a manager instead of like really having mastery over your craft. I'm the best in the world at game design or being a Unity developer or Unreal developer or something like that. And just I guess the final point and again for more context on the stuff, feel free to read the article that we wrote, but the view would just be the view on innovation. I do still see a lot of focus on, okay, I see some games that are kind of successful, so I'm going to try and do another battle royale or Among Us or whatever. So I do hope that one of the other things is like in terms of how you view innovation, how do you like think about product market fit and the validation of different new ideas is a discipline, is an art, and is something that I think needs to be developed in India over time.
Yeah, it seems like the mastery component has been complained about even from a broader than video game industry perspective, right?
Okay.
There was a study done that India has the third highest representation on GitHub, yet just 4% of engineers can write high quality code. And when
Right.
employers judge the employability of engineers, it's like roughly 50% of the graduating engineers. So it seems like there's data to support this kind of lack of mastery. How do you see that changing over time? And have you noticed that as well? Like, does that mean that the average Indian developer, is less productive than the average abroad?
I mean, I really think it comes down to mindset, and it comes down to just like shifting the attitudes towards this. Like, there's no doubt that, I mean, I understand the statistics, but clearly, like, I'm here in Silicon Valley right now, but like the CEOs of the best companies in the world are Indian. We clearly know that Indians are incredibly intelligent. So I think it's really just fundamentally, and it sounds too flippant or trivial, but like just having a focus on, instead of like, hey, I just want to get this done. I just want to finish this task. I want to understand how I'm doing the task. Why am I doing it this way? And how can I do it better? And really like focusing more on the mastery over the management. And really, I think, reevaluating, or, how I don't, and again, I can't read into the incentive systems in a lot of these companies or how people are valued. But if more companies adopted compensation, or recognition for mastery. Oh, you know uh, this person is great because they're a super developer, versus that person manages 10 people, and you know she gets the parking spot, and like things like that. Then I think that, uh, as simple as that sounds, that's my current perspective on that. I don't know if you have any other perspectives.
Yeah, 3 points. So the first is that what I find really interesting is this difference in literally like how it feels to be when you talk to game developers in India versus in the US. In the US, when you walk around Epic Games, like almost half the company is like lifelong people from the video game industry, right? They just live and breathe. Like, I am a game designer. I've worked on Gears of War. I worked on Unreal Tournament. Like, now I'm here building Fortnite. That's like how they feel like passionate about their craft over years and years. And so that lack of sort of recognition and kind of like passionate community, I think just wasn't there because there weren't that many developers. So I really expect, just like we've seen with the growth of product management in India, we're going to see the growth of video game designer, a video game developer. There's going to become these communities where people realize, like, I really want to become passionate. Because as you said, like, obviously the intrinsic intelligence level is there. It's more about like, why hasn't this existed in the first place? A next thing is, why do people even get into it? So in India, there's this tremendous pressure to either become like an engineer or a doctor. Most parents are exerting this pressure on their children, and a lot of people who become software engineers in India actually didn't have that core passion that we see in Europe or North
Hmm.
America. And so it's like, how do we then, as an employer in the game industry, develop this passion, develop this community, and like develop this craftsmanship around gaming? And I think that as the attitudes change, where parents even allow a kid to dream of becoming a game designer because they see that, hey, like this creator on Roblox is making a ton of money, or this guy working for Lila Games is doing really well for himself, then I think we'll naturally see that that employability rate is going to go way up, and we're going to see way more people finding themselves into this industry, like for the same reasons that they do abroad.
Yeah, and slightly off topic, but I think you raise a good point about the parents' influence in in India relative to other countries. Like, one thing I wasn't aware of, but I learned, just spending time in India, is that sometimes when you make an offer to someone, it's not. necessarily their decision because like the whole family lives together. It's like it's their decision plus their parents' decision for them to like jump jobs. So yeah, one of the things we're doing to address that is we're actually making a deck specifically for parents. This is who we are. This is the gaming industry. This is why your son or daughter should work with us. But yeah, I definitely thought that was an interesting aspect of India that's slightly different from what we may be used to in the West or other places.
Yeah. So I think we both are obviously super bullish on gaming
Yeah.
in India. You so far as like dedicate your life to it, your career
Yeah.
choice to it.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we can kind of end on like we've seen this tremendous path from China, Turkey, South Korea, some of these countries. How does India kind of follow in their footsteps?
Yeah. I mean, I think those countries in particular are great models. So China in particular, when you look at where they are today in certain genres like mobile free to play shooters, number one, right? They are the developers behind that. Mobile MOBAs, number one. 4X, number one. And, I had the opportunity to actually experience that firsthand at Fun Plus. And I think that, action adventure on console, Genshin Impact. I mean, they've like really targeted specific genres and then developed deep expertise. And from my own experience working at Fun Plus, like one of the ways that we did that was, we had our team in Beijing, and then we would just hire key talent from wherever in the world had it against our genre, and we would hire and bring those people in. And so I think that's one lesson that India can learn is that as we build out additional development teams in India, like pick specific genres to target and then develop extreme depth against those genres. And then where it makes sense to like bring in key experts from around the world that have worked on and have launched successful titles in those genres. And then over time, as you build expertise and experience, then I think that is what's going to lead to success. Not by spreading your chips all across the board, but really just making very deep, focused, strategic bets. And then I think in terms of Turkey, very similar. I have been so impressed by Dream Games. Match three, I consider to be the most competitive, the hardest kind of genre to crack. And yet that team, from peak, they knew that genre so well. They took all of the small nuance and expertise that they had, and they are now competing with the very best against, King and all the other companies based upon their superior insight and knowledge against that genre. And so again, speaking to depth, speaking to like really focusing on specific genres. And then I think the lesson that we can learn from Korea, for example, when we look at their entertainment industry and how they've become so great at whether it's, music or whether it's like television, creating great television shows, is that they've kind of created a lot of governmental policies and initiatives to help protect and foster and promote those industries locally. And so I do think that I would hope to see from India is like more of that, more initiatives and more specific policies to help promote gaming to develop within India, similar to Korea, similar to Canada.
Yeah, we're waiting for that Modi government to support gaming like they've been supporting Bollywood and Tollywood. So I think that India now has the opportunity to like export its cultural legacy. It's already developed
Right.
amazing games. Now it's competing on the global stage. It's quickly turning into a $5 billion market with 800 million gamers and exploding as a game development ecosystem. So now is kind of the time to for the government to act, and instead of like putting a tamper, I think we already know that they want to promote it because they've been banning like foreign games. So I think we can expect much more positive news to come.
Yeah, I am 100% there with you. And I think like the quote that we put in the end of our report had was the Wayne Gretzky Wayne Gretzky quote, right? Like try to skate to where the puck is going, not where it has been. And so that would be like for me, like the final message for other folks out there is like, we're excited by India just because we see where the market is headed. And I do think it is like for anyone who's trying to go to India right now, is it too early? Probably. But I think you kind of have to go there early because if you get there too late, you're not going to be able to reap the benefits. Well, I mean, I don't know. That's the way I'm viewing it anyway. I don't know how you view that in terms of if you had any advice for other folks who are looking at the Indian game market.
Yeah, I think that there's two types of folks. There's the types of folks who look at the Indian game market as consumers. So they're building their game and they're wondering, like, should I localize? Like, India has so many different languages, and then they have such a low average revenue per user, but my cost per user is already pretty high for most of these live ops games. Um, so that's like one question. And then the second question is like, should I have like a development office there, right? Like these are the two main questions I've been asked most
Yep.
recently. So when I hear people talk about the consumer market, I think it's super tough. If you have a high cost per user, like a game like Fortnite has a tremendously high service cost, just to have that user even play for you, then Indian market might almost like be a money pit for you because the average revenue per user is still only like $1 to $3 in non PPP terms. So it's super, super low. So that's one of the big risks that people need to understand. And if they look at the games that have succeeded on that per revenue user basis, they've either leveraged Indian culture, real money gaming, or built one of these platforms. So that's like one of the strategies if you want to attack the market that I typically advise. And then there's the developer people. So these are people who are trying to use Indian development talent, which is relatively cheap, and then leverage that to build a global game. And for those people, I think that's where it's most exciting still. I think that there's still a pretty high differential if you look at the cost of talent relative to like the quality you can get back. For all the reasons we just described, the quality is going to actually
Right.
go grow much faster than people realize. Like faster than people are going to be able to hire, these Indian game devs are going to develop, just like Indian product managers and other functions have developed. And they're going to become really high quality. And just like they've risen to become CEOs of Google and Microsoft, I expect them to develop really high, in-depth quality games as entrepreneurs like yourself take the risk to help transfer that expertise over.
100%. All right. And maybe in closing, Akash, how can people follow your billion followers that you have on the various platforms?
Oh my gosh, you're too kind. So my main gig, if you want to connect with me and if you want me to chat with you even, check out the product growth newsletter. Every single week, I write about one tech topic and one product topic. My product topics also come through Twitter and LinkedIn. So if you are a product person or a startup founder who's interested in like, how do I build product? How do I learn from like how a former Google PM thinks about building product? Try to put that content out on a daily basis. But if it's more of the weekly tech stuff, then the newsletter is where to find me.
Awesome. And I'll put links in the show notes to all that stuff. But Akash, thanks so much for the the collaboration on the report. I enjoyed myself. It was really awesome working with you on that and for this conversation as well.
Likewise, thank you.
All right. Till next time, everybody. Catch y'all later. Bye.